Well, welcome to our Precision Health Seminar Series, the first of the decade here. I'm Scott Roberts, faculty member in the School of Public Health and part of the Precision Health Education and Training Work Group. And before we jump into our fantastic speaker, I just wanted to say a few words about our Precision Health program for those of you who don't know. It's really a three-part mission for the program. The first is to try to build infrastructure to enable interdisciplinary research with tools and resources that are available to researchers across campus, including an exciting new analytics platform. So that's one element. Two is encouraging research with funding and educational events. And in fact, we have a grants program that's already dispersed over $6 million to researchers here at the university. And then finally, the big goal is really to implement findings from precision health research into real-life healthcare settings. So another element of the program that's new is a new certificate program. For those of you who are graduate students, you might be interested in learning more. You can sign up at the tables outside to learn more about our new certificate program. And also, if you're not a member, you can sign up outside as well and get on our listservs for future events like today. Also, just a little bit of housekeeping. Next month, our seminar speaker will be on February 11th. It'll be Jennifer Roberts, no relation, from the University of Maryland. She'll be discussing public health outcomes and the effects of the built environment. So we hope you'll come back for that. So today we're really excited to welcome Dr. Amy McGuire from Baylor College of Medicine. And she's going to be speaking, as you see here, about genetic privacy and investigative genetic genealogy, which has become a really hot topic, and I think illustrates this tension that we're seeing even beyond genetics between data privacy and the common good and public safety. So those kinds of tensions, if you hear about Apple's trying to unlock their phones, I feel like that broader tension is also illustrated in genetics work. And so she's going to talk to you today about how genetic databases are becoming of interest of law enforcement to help solve cold cases and other criminal justice issues, but that, of course, raises some questions about civil liberties as well. So just a little bit about Amy. She's the Leon Jaworski Professor of Biomedical Ethics, and she directs the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor College of Medicine. And perhaps not surprisingly, she researches ethical and policy issues relating to emerging technologies with an emphasis on genome research and precision medicine. I could be here all day reciting her CV, but just a few highlights. She's published over 200 peer-reviewed articles, including some high-profile pieces in Science, JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, among others, and has led numerous NIH-funded projects. And she's also been an advisor to some major initiatives in the field, the eMERGE Consortium that some of you may know about, as well as serving on the National Advisory Council for Human Genome Research. So without further ado, Amy, thanks for joining us, and the stage is yours.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you guys for coming out this afternoon. Can you hear me? Is that okay? It's great to be back here. My sister was an undergrad here. My brother was in business school here, so I haven't been in many years, but it's really nice to be back on campus and to be with you all. So from 1974 to 1986, there was one individual in the state of California who was responsible for more than 13 murders, 50 rapes, and hundreds of armed robberies. Now, they knew that this was all one individual because he left his DNA at several of the crime scenes, and he was engaging in this crime spree for more than a decade, ravaging the entire state of California. People were terrified to be in their homes. And he was a particularly violent criminal. So he had a very specific MO that he used across all of his crimes, where he would typically show up in an individual's home while they were sleeping. He'd go into the bedroom, and often there was the husband and wife in bed, and he'd wake them up by shining a very, very bright flashlight from above his head in their eyes, and he would direct them to get on their hands and knees, and he would tie them up. He'd throw shoelaces at them and say, first he'd have the wife tie the husband up, and then he'd tie the wife up. And then he'd have the husband get on his hands and knees, and he would stack plates from the kitchen on his back. So if he moved, the plates would fall and they would break, and he would know. And he'd take the wife into another room of the house, and he would brutally rape her. And then he would leave her, and he would go into the kitchen, and he'd have a beer or make a sandwich, watch some TV, hang out for about an hour, go back and rape her again. And then in some cases, he would go back and kill both the husband and the wife. In other cases, he left the home without killing them. And police spent this decade looking for this individual and trying to identify who he might be. He became known sort of nationally as the Golden State Killer because all of his crimes were committed in California. And there were several people who had seen him because they were, remained alive after the crime. And so they had many sketches of this individual of what he might look like. And this was one of the sketches that came out of what this individual looked like. So he was a Caucasian male in his 20s or 30s. And they could not figure out who this guy was. And I mentioned that he left his DNA at several of the crime scenes. So they had the DNA from multiple crime scenes. And they tried to identify him based on his DNA. So how do we typically identify criminals based on their DNA? We use a national forensic database. But this national forensic database is populated with DNA specimens from individuals who have been convicted of crimes, or in some states, individuals who have been accused of crimes. So there's a couple problems with the DNA database. One is that if you haven't been convicted or accused of a crime, then you're not in the DNA database. And also the DNA database CODIS, which is the National Forensic Database, reflects sort of the racial biases that exist in our current criminal justice system. So it may be very difficult to find Caucasian males in the database. So these crimes, he seemed to stop doing these crimes after 1986, and nobody kind of understood why. But they really seemed to stop, but they continued to search for who the suspect in these crimes might be for decades with no success. And in 2017, one of the FBI agents who had been working on the case had this idea. He said, we've got all this DNA from this guy. He's not in our forensic databases. I wonder if we could find him in other DNA databases that are out there, right? So by now, there's a bunch of DNA databases that are out there, and there are several DNA databases that collect genetic genealogy information from individuals, and the purpose of them is to do familial matching. So they said, what if we could upload this guy's DNA to one of those databases and try to find one of his relatives, and then find him through his relative? They were able to successfully do that, and on April 24th of 2018, they apprehended this gentleman who is Joseph D'Angelo as the suspect in the Golden State Killer case. So this made huge news and raised a whole bunch of questions about how law enforcement is going to be able to use our DNA when it's not in forensic DNA databases to solve cases like this. Since April 2018, several hundred other cold cases have been solved using this technique. So I just want to talk for a minute about what they actually did in this case in order to solve this crime. So I don't know if all of you can see this, but I've delineated here in green what they would normally do in any case, and in yellow what they did very specifically related to investigative genetic genealogy. So they got the crime scene DNA from the suspect. They then exhausted all of their investigative leads. So I mentioned that they put out tip lines, thousands of people called in. They had all these sketches that were out on the news and in newspapers, and people were trying to identify people who look like the sketches. They followed eyewitnesses. They did everything that you would normally do in any investigative case. Then what they did for investigative genetic genealogy is they took the crime scene DNA and they created a SNP profile from the crime scene DNA. And they uploaded it to a genetic genealogy database called GEDmatch. Now, GEDmatch is a database where you can take your DNA data that you generate from other companies. Like say you get 23andMe testing or testing through Ancestry.com. You can upload your SNP profile from those databases into GEDmatch. And GEDmatch will then link you to other people in GEDmatch who you might be related to. This is a huge industry now. Like there are millions and millions of people who are engaging in genetic genealogy. I think the last numbers were that GEDmatch has about 1.5 million consumers in their database. Ancestry has about 15 million people in their database. So this is a huge industry. So they uploaded this fake profile. They said, hi, I'm John Doe. Here's my profile. Link me to people who I might be related to. And then through the website, they got linked to several people that that John Doe shared significant enough amounts of DNA with that they suggested a genetic relationship. And they identified about a third cousin. Then the hard work comes in, because they take that third cousin and they say, okay, who is this person related to? And they start to build out a family tree. And they build out that family tree using every public data that's out there, which is actually tremendous amounts of data on all of us, right? So they say, okay, how can we build up this tree to figure out their common ancestor, and then build down the tree to figure out who all of the third cousins might be, and then let's look at each of those third cousins, who was in the right place at the right time, has the right demographic, and might be our suspect. And that's how they try to identify who they are, the person of interest might be. In this particular case, they narrowed it down to Joseph D'Angelo. He was a retired police officer living in California at the right time. He was married and had several grown children. They followed him around once they figured out that he might be their person of interest. They waited for him to discard something with his DNA on it. In this case, he threw out a used tissue, and they collected that tissue. They took the DNA from the tissue and they matched it to the crime scene DNA from the Golden State Killer case file, and it was a perfect match. Okay, so does everybody understand how it works? Okay, so that's investigative genetic genealogy. So what does this mean? Was it totally random and lucky that they were able to find Mr. D'Angelo using investigative genetic genealogy? Well, we have some colleagues who looked at, let's look at how many people are in these genetic genealogy databases, and let's infer how easy it would be to identify a relative that's a third cousin or closer in terms of your genetic relationship, and see what that means. And they inferred data from the MyHeritage database, which has about 1 million people in it, and what they found out was that based on the number of people in these databases right now, about 60% of Americans of Caucasian descent, so of European descent, you could identify their third cousin or closer. Okay, and they suspected in the next 5 years, the way that the industry is growing, 99% of white Americans will be able to be identified through a relative match using genetic genealogy. Now, I say a Caucasian individual because most of these databases, quite opposite to the forensic DNA databases that we have, are populated by individuals of European descent. And so the likelihood of identifying somebody of European descent is much, much higher using these genetic genealogy databases. So in May of 2018, right after the Golden State Killer case kind of hit the media and everybody was super excited about this, we published a blog about this, and we asked at the end of our blog, just very informally, how many people would be okay with law enforcement accessing and using their DNA data to identify criminals in cold cases. So let me just get a sense of the room. How many of you would feel comfortable having your DNA used in that way to identify suspects in crimes? Okay, so about half of you. Tell me if you're not comfortable with it, just to get a sense of. Okay, so it's not that none of you don't have an opinion. Good. Okay, so about half of you are comfortable with it. In our little informal survey, we found more people were comfortable with it. About 83% of the 278 people who answered our poll said, yeah, I'd be fine with that. It seemed like there was some sort of acceptance of this as a way to protect the public safety. But there were also at the same time a lot of articles that were coming out that raised concerns about this, and the concerns really seemed to focus on issues of privacy. And so there were articles like this one where they were showing that individuals were they were using this technology to identify suspects in less serious crimes, like assault crimes, and there were concerns about the slippery slope. Like, is the government going to be accessing DNA databases and using it to solve all kinds of things that we might not think they should be using DNA for? And so there were a lot of concerns raised by this. So to kind of understand and situate the issue from a societal perspective, I just kind of want to identify two trends that seem to be going on at the same time here. So on the one hand, we have a significant increase in the amount of data that's being generated today. And this includes genetic data that's being generated, both through healthcare and research, as well as through self-discovery like direct-to-consumer genetic testing, genetic genealogy, and other aspects like that. We also have a lot of other types of data that are being generated on all of us that when linked to our genetic information tells you a lot of information, right? I mean, I've been working a little bit with the FBI now based on this project. You'd be shocked at what's out there on all of us in the public domain that we don't even think about, that's being shared on a daily basis. So we have this sort of massive amount of both genetic and non-genetic information being shared about all of us in a very public way, increasingly. And at the same time, we're all kind of concerned about our privacy. And we're still concerned about our privacy. And I've been working on privacy for many, many, many years. And sometimes when I talk about privacy, people say, you're just getting old. Like, people these days don't care that much about their privacy. Look at the young people out there. They're posting everything on social media. You know, they're taking pictures on Snapchat 50 times a day. Like, they just don't care about their privacy. So this was actually something that we got a little bit interested in as kind of a tangential issue, which is that true? Like, are we worrying less and less about our privacy with the new generation of people coming up and sort of younger millennials? So we did a survey using Mechanical Turk, which is an online platform, in 2016 of 1,310 individuals, and we analyzed the results based on generation, just to see if there were generational differences in how people felt about their privacy. We asked individuals in the survey how concerned they were about the privacy of their health information and how concerned they were about the privacy of their online information. And you can see here that overall, 68% of individuals were concerned or very concerned about the privacy of their health information, and 69% were concerned or very concerned about the privacy of their online information. And none of this differed based on their age or generation, except for when we split out our millennials into older millennials and younger millennials. The split point seemed to be at 28 years of age. And those who were under 28 were a little bit less concerned about the privacy of their health information. My hypothesis is that they haven't really encountered the health system that much by that age. Many of them are on their parents' health insurance policies, so they may not know that they ought to be concerned, or they just may not have experience. But that's just a hypothesis. What was really interesting here is we also asked a bunch of questions about people's use of social media and how often they were online. And there was absolutely no relationship between people's use of social media, what they posted on social media, and how often they were online with their concerns about privacy. So what does this tell us? This tells us that people are posting tons and tons and tons of private information, and they're super concerned about the privacy of the information that they're posting. So the conclusion that I have is that it's really, as in everything that we do, it's all about trade-offs, right? You have to make this sort of internal, whether it's conscious or unconscious, calculation at any point in time about whether the benefits to you or to society or to others, outweigh the potential risks that you're taking. So when I shop online and I enter my, credit card number, I'm acutely aware, maybe sometimes it's subconsciously aware, that I'm giving out private information about myself, and it could be used against me. My identity could be stolen, my credit card number could be stolen. And it's really convenient for me to shop online and not have to get out of my bed to go to Target, right? And so I make that trade-off, and I decide it's worth the risk that I'm taking to my privacy to be able to use Amazon instead of getting out of bed and going to the store, right? This is the same kind of risk calculation that individuals are making when they're sharing their genetic information and other types of information as well. So we've done a bunch of studies about these types of trade-offs in the medical and research space. We know that individuals are really willing to take privacy risks when the potential benefit is to their own health. If they're doing something that they think will improve their own health, they're willing to risk their privacy, particularly if they're sick, right? Most people are willing to take some privacy risks to advance research. We found that people who have an illness, even if they know that the research won't benefit them personally, if it will benefit other people who might be going through the same thing as them in the future, so future patients, they're willing to risk some of their privacy and share their data in order to provide that benefit to future patients. The big question is whether people are willing to take the same types of risks to their informational risks, to their privacy, when the benefit is more to society as a whole in terms of the public safety and being able to follow through on criminal justice. So to solve crimes and get violent criminals off the streets. So we were very interested in this question. We haven't actually done a trade-off study yet between privacy and this particular consideration, but we did do a very brief, a very sort of quick and dirty survey using MTurk again, shortly after the Golden State Killer case came out, of 1,587 individuals. It was an online survey. This is really, really busy, but what you really need to focus on here are two questions. One, we asked, should law enforcement be able to search genealogic websites that match DNA to relatives? And what's important here that you see is 91% of people in our survey said yes, they should be able to do it if it's for a violent crime. 89%, the gray line, said yes, they should be able to do it if it's for a crime against children. The yellow line, which is 91%, said yes, they should be able to do it if it's to identify a missing person. But only 46% said yes, they should be able to use this for non-violent crimes. So there seems to be a distinction that people are making, that they don't want to go down that slippery slope of using genetic genealogy databases to identify individuals who might be a suspect in a non-violent crime. We also asked a question about whether law enforcement should be able to search cell phone records or to identify location information from cell phones using without a warrant in order to solve a crime. And we asked this because this particular question was pending before the Supreme Court when we did the survey, and we were very curious sort of how that would relate to what they said about the use of genetic databases. So very similar findings. 85, 82, and 78% said, yeah, you should be able to search cell phone records and cell tower records for violent crimes, crimes against children, and missing persons. But we're not so sure. Only 50% of us think you should be able to do it for nonviolent crimes. So a couple months later, the Supreme Court issued their opinion in this particular case, which is Carpenter versus the United States. And what this case was asking was whether law enforcement could access cell tower record, location record, without a warrant in order to identify individuals in a crime. So imagine this situation, right? You are on the corner of West Street and 3rd Street, which I don't even know if that exists anymore, but okay, you're on the corner of West Street and 3rd Street, and there's an ATM machine, and one of those, armored trucks pulls up to get the money out. Somebody pulls up behind him, gets out of the car, robs him at gunpoint, steals all the money, and gets away, right? There's a cell tower close to that area, and it records all of the cell phones that were in that neighborhood 30 minutes prior to the crime being committed and 10 minutes after the crime being committed. And the police want to know who was in that area at that corner during that time period, right? So if they can get that information, they're kind of going on a fishing expedition. They may get 5,000 phone records, right? And say, okay, there were 5,000 people in that area. Well, let's say now, 3 months later, across town, the same crime gets committed, and they want to get the records from that cell tower, and then they want to cross-examine who was in both places at the time of the crime, and they might narrow it down to 5 or 10 people, who then they can go on and use as investigative leads and try to identify who's the criminal, right? So that's what they were asking to do. And this was challenged, saying that's a violation of the 4th Amendment, which protects against unreasonable search and seizure without probable cause and a warrant, right? You have to have probable cause that you're looking for a particular person and get a warrant to search records. And the argument that was made by the defense was, well, by the law enforcement was, well, this isn't unreasonable search and seizure. We don't need a warrant because there's a well-recognized exception to the 4th Amendment, which says that if you voluntarily share your private information with a third party, it's no longer considered private. And they were saying that all of us voluntarily share our location information with our cell provider, with AT&T or Verizon or whoever. When we sign our contract and get a cell phone, we are voluntarily sharing our location information at all times with our cell provider. And that was being challenged in court. What the Supreme Court found was that no, that doesn't qualify. We're not going to say that you're voluntarily sharing your location information when you get a cell phone, because that's not really what we meant. But they said, but this is super narrow, our finding, and this doesn't mean that we're at all chipping away in any other sphere the third-party doctrine. So that still holds. So there's a big open question now of whether DNA data is similar to cell tower location data, and whether you voluntarily sharing that information with a genetic genealogy database, which presumably if you're uploading your data to that database, it's a more active sharing, whether that would invoke the third-party doctrine, and that law enforcement could then access that information to do their search without a warrant. Make sense? Okay, perfect. All right, so how can we protect individuals? Some people have said law enforcement should not be able to do this. They should not be able to access they should not be able to access genetic genealogy websites to solve crimes. One state has tried to legislate against it. In January of 2019, there was a bill that was passed in Maryland. Maryland and DC are the only two states that don't allow law enforcement to use the National Forensic DNA database, CODIS, to do familial matches. So within CODIS, they have a limited amount of DNA in those databases. You can't do extensive familial matching, but you can identify first-degree relatives, so parent, child, sibling. And in most states, you're allowed to do that when you're investigating a crime, to identify who the relative might be, even if you don't identify your exact suspect. But in Maryland and DC, you can't do that. And Maryland tried to introduce a bill that would say, and in this state, law enforcement is not allowed to do familial matching using genetic genealogy databases. That bill did not pass, but it is indicative of what some states might do to try to legislate against this. So one thing I want to kind of pause for a second and ask is, when we think about privacy and genetic genealogy databases and the use of them for investigation, whose privacy are we worried about? So let me just ask you guys, whose privacy are we worried about? Your own, okay, but let's think about the Joseph D'Angelo case, right? Whose privacy were we concerned about would we be concerned about in his case? Huh? So maybe the relatives, his children, people that might be matched, right? Anybody else's privacy?
False positive.
A false positive, really good. So we might be worried that we identify somebody and we go down that lead and it's not the right person, right? Yeah. So there's several different players, and I kind of want to walk us through each person's privacy, and I'll get to we can talk a little bit more about the false lead as well. So there's the customer, right? This is Sally. She's the one who's super interested in where did my family come from, and I'm going to do genetic genealogy, and I'm going to upload my DNA to GEDmatch, which is the database that was used for D'Angelo's case, right? So are we concerned about Sally's privacy? A little bit? Okay, so we just talked about the third-party doctrine. How many of you think she has voluntarily shared her information with a third party in such a way that it should be able to be accessible for use by law enforcement? Okay, so some of you would say, no, she doesn't have a legitimate privacy interest in her DNA data once it's been uploaded to GEDmatch. How is her privacy actually protected? Typically, it's through the terms of service of the company. So it's a contractual agreement. So whatever the company says they're going to do to protect your privacy, they're supposed to do. And if they don't do that, then there's the potential for them to get a slap on the wrist by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and they could potentially get fined as well. But there aren't really strong protections in place if they violate their own terms of service. All right, the next person we might be worried about their privacy is D'Angelo, right? But I think most people would probably agree, and we generally agree in society, that if you commit a crime and you leave your DNA at the crime scene, then you forfeit any rights that you have to the privacy of that DNA. And so we might not be as concerned about him. So what you guys pointed out is, what about all the people in between them, right? So we identify Sally, who's the third cousin of D'Angelo, but then we got to build the tree, right? So what about all those people on the tree? Are we worried about the privacy of all of those people on the tree, right? So I think one way to think about this is to actually get a really clear understanding of what is it that the police are seeing and what is it that they're doing. Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions around this. So the first thing is, a lot of people say, well, I don't want them looking at the DNA of all of those people on the tree. Well, they don't at all. What they see is what any customer sees, which is basically this. It says you have a match, right? You have 3 matches. You have a match with match number 1. On chromosome 3, you guys share 17.6 and 132.1 centimorgans of DNA. 17.6 means almost nothing. All of us share centimorgans of DNA because we're all somewhat related way, 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 way back when. So they would probably throw that out. 132, they might say, okay, that seems a little bit like could be a relative, and they say, what does that mean in terms of the degree relative that it would be, and should we pursue this or not? The rest of them, matches 2 and 3, have very low percentages of centimorgans that are shared, and so they may not pursue those leads at all. And then they say, okay, let's hone in on match number 1, and let's see if there's, who match number 1 matches to, and on what chromosome, and how many centimorgans they share, and can we somehow build a family tree out of this? Okay, so that's all they're seeing on these customers. Okay? They don't get names, and they don't get DNA. They do get names in the sense that they look, this is also very confusing, but they get the username that you share when you upload your data. Now, what's confusing about that is some people upload data for their multiple family members, or they may have a community organizer who uploads all the data for the community and uses their own email address and name to upload those data. So you have to kind of figure out, like we've gone through several cases together with law enforcement, and they've said, well, we found this person, they had this email address, but we're pretty sure that's his mother and not him, and so we can deduce that this is him. And it's really like tricky investigative work. The second question the second objection that people have is, oh my gosh, they're going to be testing the DNA. They're going to be following all these leads and following people around and collecting their DNA and testing the DNA of tons and tons and tons of people, and that's violating their rights to privacy, right? So this is, I'm trying to get real data on this. This is anecdotal, confidential data from a couple of cases, but it gives you a general sense. So when you do investigative genetic genealogy, right, these were 4 cases where they did investigative genetic genealogy. What do you think was the maximum number of people that they had to collect DNA from in order to solve any one of the crimes? Anybody want to guess? 6? 45? Huh? 1? Okay. The maximum number was 10. Using investigative genetic genealogy, where they actually collected DNA and did testing. Oftentimes it's just 1, or it might be 1 or 2. When they do regular investigations, right, on these same exact cases, before they used investigative genetic genealogy, what was the maximum number of people they had to test their DNA prior to using the investigative genetic genealogy? Now, none of these actually solved the crime. In this case, the maximum 10, the crime was solved, okay? So what was the maximum that they used prior to using investigative genetic genealogy? What's the maximum number of people that they tested their DNA? 44? You're the one who said 45 before. Okay, we're hedging our bets. What else? Anything else? Huh? A few hundred? More than 600. So what's really surprising here is that I don't think people realize what law enforcement does to try to solve crimes and how many people they investigate, and you would never know if you're investigated, if they do it well and if they do it right. And the same thing with investigative genetic genealogy. If they go down the wrong path and they're following best practices and they do it right, that person should never be contacted and should never know that they're even the subject of investigation unless they get stuck and need help from somebody to help build out the tree, and then they might ask them for permission to collect their DNA and help build out the tree. So the problem is that there are many, many, many law enforcement agencies, and not everybody does this well or does this right. So what are the current companies doing with regard to investigative genetic genealogy? So this has kind of shook up the direct-to-consumer genetic testing industry. And when the Golden State Killer case came out, everybody was like, oh my God, what do we do? Like, should law enforcement be able to access this? We are stewards of our customers' data. We didn't warn them that this could be used in this way. Should we try to prevent it? How do we try to prevent it? Should we work with law enforcement? We want to help protect the public safety. These are horrible people who have committed really violent crimes in most cases, and we want to bring them to justice, and we want to protect others. So they have taken very, very different approaches to this. 23andMe and Ancestry.com, which are direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies, have both said, we will not work with law enforcement. We will not let them access your DNA data without a valid warrant. And so they have said no to law enforcement access to their customers' data. Family Tree DNA, which is housed in Houston, decided, yes, we want to work with law enforcement. We think it's a good thing. So they changed their terms of service, and they allow now an opt-out for their customers to say, I don't want you to include my DNA in the database that law enforcement can access if they choose to opt out. I think for their European customers, because of some of the laws in Europe now, they have to opt in, but for US customers, they can opt out. They've had, I don't want to quote this because it's not exactly right, but somewhere between 10 and 20%, I think, of their customers have opted out of this, but a fairly low percentage of them. They also work really closely with law enforcement. They have to register as law enforcement, declare themselves to be law enforcement. They go into a particular part of the database, and they're very transparent about how this works. And they've also partnered with individuals like, you guys remember Elizabeth Smart, who was, I think she was kidnapped, and I think she was murdered, right? And no, she was found, yes, that's right. And her father is a huge advocate for solving crimes, and he's actually gone out and done like public service announcements where he said, please send your DNA to Family Tree DNA in order to help solve crimes. So this might be a motivating factor for people who aren't really interested in their genetic genealogy, but they want to help solve crimes in this way. GEDmatch, which was the other company that was used, it was fully open. They had an opt-out. They changed their terms of service to an opt-out. They then violated their own terms of service in some way because they said we would only allow law enforcement to access these data for violent crimes. Then they allowed them to access it for a nonviolent crime. There was a huge outcry, and they ended up switching to an opt-in system, which was very, very detrimental to law enforcement because they had 1.4 million people in their database. Once they switched to opt-in, it's growing and growing and growing, but the last number I heard was roughly around 200,000 people had opted in, which makes it really difficult for law enforcement to identify people when you only have that pool of individuals. And it creates, it makes it more work. They have to investigate more people, and they have to look to other databases and resources as well. So one of the big issues that has come up is that law enforcement has been doing this without a warrant under this idea that the third-party doctrine applies and that they can go in and search these databases that are available. This has been tested recently, and there was a prosecutor in Florida who said, I am going to try to get a warrant to see if I can access all of the individuals in the GEDmatch database, all 1.4 million, even those who have not opted in to law enforcement access. And he was able to successfully get a warrant to do that search and was able to search GEDmatch's entire database. So that warrant has not yet been challenged in court. I think a lot of people are very interested to see how specific that warrant was and whether, I would presume that the argument is for getting a warrant is that based on the research, you can currently identify 60% of familial matches for Caucasian for Caucasian individuals in the United States, right? We soon think we can identify 99%. Is that mathematical probability sufficient probable cause if you know that you are looking for a Caucasian suspect to be able to access these databases and do this search? I think that's a very open and controversial legal question. In the meantime, what we've done to try to self-regulate in this space is that the Department of Justice has come out with an interim policy, basically trying to set best practices of what you can and can't do. This doesn't apply to all law enforcement agencies, but what it does is it sets out some parameters. It says that law enforcement should only be using this technique for violent crimes or crimes against to identify missing persons, and that it should only be used as a technique of last resort. So you have to go through all of your other investigative work before you can try to do investigative genetic genealogy. So some people think that's a really good thing because they want to put some limits on the use of this. Others say not so good, because what if you have an active kidnapping, for example? You want to act fast to try to find out who that person is. And if this is the best way to do it, maybe we should be using this as a technique of first resort. They also limit how you can use the information that you're getting from this. So they said even if you get DNA data from your search, you can't use it to go back and try to identify genetic predispositions to certain diseases or anything like that. And you have to get rid of the information as soon as the case is closed. They have limitations on how you can use the data, and they have specific recommendations around transparency. So you can't create a fake profile and pretend you're not law enforcement anymore, according to their best practice standards. You have to actually say, I'm law enforcement and this is how I'm going to use this information. But there really is no way to regulate people from creating fake profiles. There isn't currently, and that's a big issue. And that raises tremendous security issues, not just for the law enforcement agent who's going to go out there and create a fake profile and dupe the public or the consumers, but for other individuals as well. So there have been several articles that have been published that talk about the security risks of these DNA databases. And I think what you have to understand is, like, let's look at GEDmatch, for example. GEDmatch was created by 2 retired businessmen who were part of Family Tree DNA, and they said, you know, it would be really cool if we had other tools to try to connect more freely with our relatives. So they set up this database as a hobby. It's a nonprofit database. They make no money from it. They got 1.4 million people in it. They have no background in informatics or security or data analytics. And so the database naturally has a lot of limitations to it. That wasn't the purpose for them setting it up. And so these academics went in and said, okay, what's the vulnerability of these databases? And they said it's pretty high. And individuals can basically fake profiles, and they can do a whole bunch of things with that. They can misdirect investigations by planting sort of genetic profiles into the database. There can be con artists who defraud victims by creating fake profiles. And then there's a real concern about sort of national security and political operatives blackmailing opponents. Think about the implications of this for, you know, anybody who's undercover or CIA agents. I mean, your DNA is left everywhere you go. And if we can identify in a couple years 99% of individuals of European descent in the United States based on familial matching using these databases, that creates a lot of risk. So what have we done to try to combat this risk? One thing that we've done is GEDmatch said, this is just way too much. They were the main target of a lot of this criticism, and they recently got acquired by Verigen. Verigen is a spinoff from Illumina, and they are dedicated completely to working with law enforcement to develop tools for investigative genetics. And so they've acquired GEDmatch. They promised to keep the same terms of service. You have to opt in, but there's a lot of questions about what this does. This is now a for-profit company as opposed to a not-for-profit company, and there's big questions about whether this will become the trend in doing this. The other thing that's happened is a lot of people in the genetic genealogy community have said, well, we should just have a forensic DNA database that people opt into, like GEDmatch. And so the first one has come out. It's called DNA Solves. You can opt in to upload your DNA to this, knowing that it will be used specifically for the purposes of solving crimes. One of the problems with this is that this database has to become, first of all, there's several different groups that are starting to generate these databases. The more competition you have, the more spread out people are across databases. And you really have to have the size of a GEDmatch database, like 1.4 million people, right, for it to be useful to law enforcement. The other thing is that some of these are for-profit, others are being conceptualized as not-for-profit. I think there's questions about whether we should be profiting off of this endeavor to protect the public safety and how that works. Okay, any questions about that? Before I have a couple of other things I want to talk about, but any burning questions? Yeah?
How do those solving crime websites protect security? Like you were talking about with the security issues for the other
So,
days.
okay, great. So how do these websites protect security? So Verigen, for example, is a much bigger for-profit company that has the resources to create security protections. So one of the major security protections would be like having digital signatures or encrypting data, you know, to try to prevent false uploads. DNA Solves would be set up so nobody breaks into the CODIS database. It's highly, highly secure, because we know how to secure data at the government level. So you would hope that the people who are setting up these specific forensic DNA databases are better equipped to set them up with higher security standards in place. Yeah. Okay. Okay, we'll take one more question, 2 more questions, and then I'll go to the last one. Go ahead.
I was just wondering what
Oh.
kind of oversight is that?
Yeah. So the question was, what enforcement mechanisms are there for making sure law enforcement follows the rules? And the answer is none right now, and that's a major, major, major problem. So we're about a year and a half out from the Golden State Killer, like opening this giant field up. The first step was to try to set best standards of what should the rules even be, which is what the Department of Justice has tried to do and others are still trying to do. But I think we still have a lot of work to figure out, okay, how can you actually, not only what are the enforcement, but how do you actually know when somebody's not following the rules? Because it's really, there's no sort of accountability in terms of knowing when somebody's doing something that they shouldn't be doing. And so in many of these cases, in fact, one of the limitations in the Department of Justice is this generates only an investigative lead. You're never arresting somebody just based on investigative genetic genealogy. You're using it to identify where your leads are, and then you're following those leads. And so this usually doesn't get even admitted into a court of law during the prosecution, right? Because it's irrelevant. You just found what lead you're following, and then how you actually identified that that person was your suspect is what gets submitted into the court of law. And so we don't even know sometimes when cases are using this technique in order to identify leads. Erin, did you have a question?
Real quick, when a company acquires another company, do the privacy practices transfer over, or do they start from scratch?
Yeah, so really interesting question of what happens when a company acquires another company. Do the privacy rules transfer or not? They should, in some cases, transfer, but not always, and that's an FTC question of whether you still have to uphold the privacy of your consumers. What Verigen did is they basically, every consumer of GEDmatch had to go in and then agree to rehab their data go into Verigen. So not always, but that's a very open question. Yeah. Okay. So one thing I just want to address real quickly before we finish up is there's a big question I think that people worry about in maybe this room and in the rooms that I sit in of, okay, this is fine. Law enforcement is accessing these genetic genealogy databases. This is where people have voluntarily shared information. The purpose is to link to relatives that they're genetically related to. That makes a whole lot of sense. But gosh, are they going to start coming after our research databases and our clinical databases? And first I want to just kind of put you at ease and say, I have not heard anything from any law enforcement agencies that they would find that useful or that they would pursue that in the coming years. But you never know. And so what protections are out there? Well, with regard to health information, the way that we typically protect health information, the strongest protection we have is through the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA. But I do want to point out that there are important exceptions to HIPAA for law enforcement access. So HIPAA-covered entities can disclose protected health information to law enforcement without any consent or authorization from the individual to prevent or lessen a serious and imminent threat to the health and safety of the individual or the public, which seems kind of like this, right? To comply with a court order or warrant or subpoena, which they did in Florida, right? And then for the purposes of identifying or locating a suspect, fugitive, material witness, or missing person, but then they say it has to be limited to demographic and health information about that person. There's other exceptions as well that might apply, but these are the main ones. So that might not help us very much with regard to health information. There are also some state laws that provide additional protections for confidentiality and privacy of health information, so we'd have to look state to state to see if any of those would get us out of this bind. The thing that I think can reassure us a little bit is that law enforcement would have to do a whole lot more work if they access genetic databases that were held as part of your health records, because we don't typically do familial matching within the health system, and that's what they want. They want to know who the family matches are. And so they'd have to actually build out that system and do their own familial matching, which seems like quite a bit of work. Interestingly, research data is probably the most well protected because we have certificates of confidentiality. And under the 21st Century Cures Act, we actually have heightened protection under certificates of confidentiality for research data, where you automatically get a certificate of confidentiality for NIH-funded research data, and you can apply for it for other types of data. And it actually allows you to refuse to give over research data. In fact, you can't give over research data even with a subpoena without the individual's consent. And so this is probably the most heightened protection we have against law enforcement access to data. If you have questions about certificates, there's a website here. There's a really great kiosk on the NIH website around the certificates of confidentiality. So with all of this, some people have argued, you know what, there's so much information out there. It's really useful to the public safety. Maybe it's time that we have a universal forensic database and everybody just gets in it in the United States. This is obviously a hugely controversial proposal. I don't actually see it happening from a political standpoint anytime soon, but it's certainly something that I think we can think about. It gets rid of the need for familial matching altogether, because if everybody's in the database, you can just do direct matching for criminals. I think we're starting to make some headway in this space. In October of this past year, we had a really fascinating conference at Banbury Center that I helped organize. And it was the first time we really got the companies, we got law enforcement, all levels of law enforcement, we got consumers, people in the genetic genealogy community, all together for 3 days to talk about these issues. And I was telling Scott and others the other night that I think the biggest win in this conference is by the end of the 3 days, everybody was speaking to each other, which oftentimes for those of us who do multidisciplinary research, that's the best thing you can hope for. And we're still working on the outputs of that meeting, but there were several things that we really focused on, including we need to have quality standards. Everybody's got to be who's doing this has to be doing it well, because the problems come when they don't know what they're doing and they contact individuals who might be a sixth cousin who actually mean nothing, and then they really feel like their privacy was violated. We need to have better security and accountability in place. So going back to the question in the back of like, there's got to be enforcement mechanisms to make sure that people are not breaking the rules. And we need more transparency and consent around this. And those are kind of the 3 areas that I think we need to develop policy. So I will end there and see if any of you have any questions. I think we have 5 minutes if anybody has anything they want to ask.
Well, thanks, Amy. And I've got the mic here for people who might have questions. There's a in the back there.
Thank you. It's fascinating. So I'm just thinking, extrapolating. So there's a lot of inequity in some of the systems that are involved here, in healthcare, law enforcement, government, like all of those things. Mm-hmm. And I think that bears out in the populations of people that are in those databases and those who are probably intentionally not in them. Mm-hmm. So I guess from your perspective, what would be needed in order to kind of ensure equity in this like arena, given that some of the supporting organizations and structures that are involved are inequitable right now?
Yep. So ironically, I actually think that investigative genetic genealogy helps to offset some of the inequities in the ways that I talked about in some way, because it does address sort of the racial biases that exist in our forensic DNA databases by sort of oversampling for individuals of European descent or Caucasian individuals. So in some ways that helps a little bit. I agree with you 100%. Certainly a universal DNA database would help, right? And it's a self-perpetuating problem, like particularly in the criminal justice system, right? So you have more people in the database who are African American, you're more likely to identify people who are suspect of crimes and solve the crimes where there was an African American perpetrator. Then you have more people in the database who are African American, and if we could kind of break that cycle, it might help us a little bit with the issue of the criminal justice system, although I am not going to pretend that that will solve all of our biases within the criminal justice system by any stretch of the imagination. But it's a really difficult problem, and I think it's not something we can ignore. You're right. There's inherent inequities in all of these systems. And we want to make sure that we develop policies that, if they can't address them, at least don't exacerbate them. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi.
Hey.
I was just curious, given the possibility of people creating fake profiles with their genetic data, as you discussed, if given GEDmatch News acquisition, if there's any efforts regarding like KYC, know your customer, of having to like upload, your passport or your, driver's license. That's like very common in financial services for these sorts of.
Yes, I think there's a lot of discussion of that. among the companies themselves.
I'm not endorsing that. That sounds pretty creepy, but just.
Well, I think in terms of like, there's been a lot of discussion around like digital signatures and encryption and things like that, that yes, you should have to verify that the information you're getting is from, you know, where they say it's from and that it's a valid source and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Other questions?
So if newborn screening is ever expanded to include genetic information, would that end up going into some sort of universal forensic database?
So I have not heard any, proposals that it does either include genomic screening or go into a forensic database. So I mean, I think it's very open. Those of you who are familiar with newborn screening here in Michigan, we have a similar, Michigan and Texas are kind of bounded by our class action lawsuits against our state newborn screening programs for using those data without explicit consent for research purposes. So I think we'd have to overcome all of those hurdles of how does it get used. Again, the value to law enforcement, and I can't emphasize this enough, is the familial matching piece of it. It's not the actual DNA itself. Now, of course, you can get to the familial matching if you have the DNA, but most people in law enforcement don't have that skill set and don't have the, that's a lot to do. So they would have to create sort of a, shadow database that does the familial matching because that's what they're looking for. So I don't know, it's an open question. I think when people talk about the slippery slope of data privacy and law enforcement access, that's one of the things they worry about. Yep.
I could envision a recovery against that.
Yeah, so the question was, could law enforcement, we have bad actors in law enforcement. We know that. I mean, we've gotten more and more publicity around that. What if you have a bad actor in law enforcement who uses this to like plant DNA at a crime scene and then is not the actual suspect and frame somebody? So I think that's a problem regardless of whether you use genetic genealogy or other types of forensic data to solve crimes. And it's a huge problem, obviously, and that person, we should do everything in our power to identify people like that and prosecute them to the full extent of the law, I would think. I don't think we can prevent bad actors, without, it's a bigger issue of screening police officers and those sorts of things. Interestingly, just like Joseph D'Angelo, several of the suspects who have been identified using this technology have been ex-police officers or current police officers. There was a case in Texas where it was a current police officer who was pulling women over on the side of the road and raping them at night and under the auspices of giving them tickets. So, oftentimes police officers might not be found out in other ways because there's, sort of the brotherhood, sisterhood of the force, and they have protections in certain ways, and this might be a way to get at them. So I don't have a good answer for that other than, I think that's a bigger problem that we need to try to address. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we're at the top of the hour. I think Amy can stay a little bit longer, though, if people have burning questions and want to come up afterwards. But let's thank her for a fantastic talk.
I just want to say one more thing, because I almost forgot. So I will tell you that the first case using this technique to exonerate somebody who was through the Innocence Project was reported. So that's also one way in which this is being used. So.
Okay. Well, thanks, and thanks to everybody for coming. And again, February 11th is our next seminar.